I'm Brian Cam, and I'm a writer, podcaster, budding philosopher of some kind. But yeah, that has its own set of problems. And I'm here to talk with Aman about how we got to where we stand philosophically. So, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
It's a short introduction from me. So I'm just doing one thing at the moment. So I work as a AI scientist at Alexa, and yeah, that's basically what I'm doing at the moment. Also trying to reread some of Nassim Taleb, but that's it.
Yeah. So, you're reading Anti-Fragile at the moment?
Yeah, I'm also going back to Skin in the Game from the last time we talked. I think there are some more ideas there. So Anti-Fragile is just not it. Yeah,
Right.
Skin in the
And have you read the whole of the Inserto series? Because I
Yeah.
know one other person who's done that.
Yeah, I did. I found it super exciting for some. I love his style.
Yeah, what are you getting out of Skin in the Game at the moment? I haven't read that one.
Skin in the Game. Yeah, the thing that really jumps out at me is that with Anti-Fragile, he has this idea, okay, like how probability and risk taking, all of these fit into systems, and what to do with these, like with this knowledge, and how to make yourself more like anti-fragile to the world, right? So this is more about risk taking from your personal perspective, right? But then with Skin in the Game, I think what he's trying to do is he's trying to make a ethical, moral framework based on the ideas of anti-fragile. So now he's going one step ahead, I guess. So now it's not just personal anymore. He's also trying to make a case that, okay, as a society, how can we be more anti-fragile, and can we derive a system of ethics based on these ideas, his
Oh,
ideas.
interesting. So it's kind of like taking the principles that he's talked about at an individual level and seeing what they would look at the societal level. Is that
Yeah, or more of the ethical
okay?
ethical
Ethical,
ethical side, not just for personal gain, but like what should you do, like what is
right?
the right thing to do for in the society and for yourself and in general.
So the normative kind of like how to live. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess all of philosophy in the in the end just kind of like prescribe ends up prescribing a way to live. So that was the natural path to take, right? I guess.
Yeah, exactly. I'm thinking about these kind of like fractal elements of like when principles apply, in your individual life, but they also seem to apply in small group dynamics and then also at the kind of level of societies and history and things like that as well. And so we could get into that, but you and I seem to have we haven't known each other for very long, but we seem to have quite a lot in common besides just having read Taleb. And so there's something like, I think we talked about this a little bit last time, which is that there's some kind of affinity, and yet we must have come to this point very differently. So I wondered if you could just talk about how you view your sort of own process of thinking or intellectual journey, if that, like over the course of your life. If I mean, it doesn't have to be a super detailed one, but what were some of the big moments, big influences, or things like that?
Okay. Mine would be pretty short because for example, compared to you, I've never done like a proper deep study of philosophy, right? I was more into like, okay, let me read some stuff. I've been always naturally kind of curious, and I was always thinking in terms of like philosophy. But then it all basically kind of starts with stoicism, I guess, at some point when you are a teenager, and then you start with the dabbling a bit in Buddhism, and then slowly that kind of like starts to form your view of the world. But then we're also like, I'm also in in the tech thing, so of
Yeah.
course you get some of the ideas from those. Like you have to read the canons in tech, like gun jumps and steel, and then
Oh yeah.
yeah, sovereign individual, lean startup, and those kind of things. So that kind of forms like the bedrock. But then what really happened when I really started like until then it was for me just entertainment, right? I mean, I would just watch it, like read something, and yeah, this is really fun and this is nice. But when did I actually start to apply or
Mm,
think seriously about this to my life problems was like when I was working on my thesis. So
okay.
I was like, okay, and So I was doing my thesis in my University of Amsterdam, and I was like, okay, what kind of topics? My supervisor was pretty chill first, so
Right.
she was like, okay, you can pick any topic you want. Just like she gave me complete freedom, right?
And what was the subject? You were studying machine learning already,
Yeah,
or
artificial, yeah, AI, artificial
okay.
intelligence,
Mm.
with some specialization in NLP, like natural
Right.
language processing, right? So it had to do something with this, but then it could be like it's very broad in general, right? And so I had this freedom, but then with all that freedom, as they say, there comes great responsibility, right? So I was like, okay, how do I select? What topic do I pick? Right? I just cannot
Mm.
pursue whatever I'm interested in, because 2 months from now I'll be interested in something else, and I'll run off and I'll never be able to. And thesis is very, very kind of. Did we drop Brian? I'm
No,
drop.
I actually
Oh, okay.
clicked something the wrong thing. So
All right. Yes, and thesis can be like, it's kind of difficult over the long period. I mean, you're working on this for like 5 years, so you know how difficult it can be sometimes to write things
Mm,
and think about these ideas. Anyway, so I was like, okay, how do I pick a topic? Or what makes a great paper? What makes a
yes.
great work? And that is the question I was asking myself. Now I have worked in startups, my own startups before, like two of them. They
Mm,
were
mm,
not successful, but so what I came. So I was like, okay, what did I do there, and what kind of made it successful, and what can I learn from these? And then I was like, okay, if you look at any paper, you never know. Like it can get accepted into like really good journals and stuff, but you'll never know what impact it will make in the future, right? You'll never it's impossible to predict. Like ideas which seem very insignificant now might be very famous later on. So
mm,
that's
mm,
that's a very hard way to predict. Like that's a prediction problem, and I don't want to do prediction. It's basically prophesizing, and doing that kind of thing is just kind of never works, right?
mm.
You just have tastes. Yeah, go on.
No, I've got lots of questions for you. So, um,
Yeah, okay, I'll finish this quick, right?
yeah,
uh,
go for it.
so I was like, okay, why don't I take a market-based approach to it? So imagine the research community is, so they say, right? This thing was really inspired to me, that we stand on the shoulders of giants and stuff. So what does the community really want? Like what? So for me, the great good ideas are those ideas which give rise to other good ideas, right? So for me, a really good book is a book which I'll read and I'll have thousand ideas popping in my head, that, oh, I should be writing that, I should be doing this. Like it's inspiring. So for me, that would be a great book, right? And that would be good work. So I wanted my work to be something like which leads to more work. Doesn't have to be great by itself, and hopefully if it does it enough, then it might have a chance of greatness, like down the line, let's say.
Mm, mm. So kind of a fertile ground or seeds for lots of different ideas, something like that.
Yeah, something like that. Like it's like give them a tool, a framework in a way,
Yeah.
right? Then they can take it and then run with it. It's like almost like in a way of thinking about it in terms of like software engineering again. Like you instead of giving them the solution, you give them the tool that they can then use and then build more things out of those things, like tools for thought or things like that. So
Yes.
something so then this way of thinking about it from the market of what is actually useful, then you come into this idea of empiricism. And then I was also, one thing I did during my thesis was like, okay, I'm gonna make like great theories, right? I'm gonna make like a nice framework and stuff.
Mm.
It was so nice, but then three months down the line, your experiments give you something completely different, and then you have to reject and keep rejecting. So that's the wrong way I found to approach. You need to not make a frame or not make a theory and then try to like fit everything into it, but instead let your experiment data guide you, uh, without marrying yourself to some theory.
Right. So it involves a lot of experimentation.
A lot of experimentation. So yeah, most of my, I think, so during this period, I think the ideas we keep talking about again, the causality thing, and everything being reduced to science. And this was the time I was reading lots of this was the time I read Inserto, basically.
Mm,
I
mm.
was also reading Wolfram of Mathematica. So he's also has this whole thing that the physicists now need to abandon,
Right.
reductionism, and move into like he's like computational physics basically.
Sorry, discard reductionism, did you say? Or
Not discard but move beyond,
move
like the way,
beyond?
yeah, so his idea is this, that with Newton we were really successful, that he used maths to describe
Mm.
nature, and it really worked for first time, because before that maths was just something like you do some puzzle solving maybe, and then now Newton was like, no, we could probably use these equations to actually model reality, and
Right.
you model reality using like small equations, right? And so we took that, we ran with it. Now we are at stages of making differential equations to model, I don't know, like like a jet engine, or like, things like a large hadron collider using
Mm.
differential equations. But now if you're trying to describe the whole of universe using just equations, it's not working according to him. What
Mm.
works is if you define some computational processes like Conway's game of life, and he found something really, so from a computational perspective, like run computational experiments, and computational experiments will are better model of reality than equations. So it's a step up from maths to computation.
Okay, interesting. So kind of running, yeah, I see computational trials rather than trying to figure out a kind of a priori or abstract theory that explains things. Is that
Yes.
right? Okay.
Yes, exactly.
And so you said in your thesis that you were trying to be very generative and put a lot of ideas in there. So what did you kind of end up did you deliver on that, or like what kind of ideas were you working on?
So what we did was we were doing lifelong learning in machine learning, which is like nowadays what's the problem with models is that if it learns something and you teach it a new task, then it completely forgets the old task. And this is called
Yes.
catastrophic forgetting. We discussed about this, remember? And so, unless we've solved this problem of catastrophic forgetting, we will never be able to achieve AGI, because humans can learn one task after the other task, right? So, I was basically trying to do this lifelong learning in NLP, like natural language processing. And this might not be the right audience, but I'll try to make it very distilled.
Yeah,
So I
please.
came up with, yeah. So most of this lifelong learning thing and catastrophic forgetting research has been done in computer vision, but very few has been done on language. And language presents its own problems because there is a sequence problem. So the problem with okay, I'm getting into the details now. But with lifelong learning, you still have this time problem, right? So you need to learn one task after one task after one task. But with language you have another sequence on top of that sequence, so you have words which come afterwards. So it's a different problem. What I'm trying to say, from vision and language, it's slightly different, right? And some of the things that some of the so people were using an experimental framework to do experiments and find new methods and models in computer vision.
Hmm.
Those wouldn't work in language, or these were giving you a wrong results, like misleading results, because it was not fit for language. So I came up with a new framework that actually fits language natively and works in with those constraints. And then based on that framework, we were able to come up with new models which were able to outperform the ones which came
Wow.
with vision.
So
So
how does language differ from vision?
So one way is this, that vision by itself is like, it doesn't have to be sequential, right? An image is an image,
Right.
but language has this sequence. So words come after words, right? So so they used to use something called LSTM. Now they use transformers, but LSTM already had a catastrophic problem. So if you have a too long text, you'll start to forget the old parts. The model will start to forget old parts of the text when reading new parts. So these are the kind of things in general. But yeah, this is good. This is a good
That's
summary.
okay. Yeah. And I pasted a link in the chat, which is just because I did a podcast at one point about the stability plasticity dilemma. Is
Yeah,
that's kind of related to what you're to the catastrophic forgetting, right?
yeah. We have lots of like there are loads of methods which try to solve it using the stability and plasticity on top of
Mm.
networks. Making sure, okay, you have like a parameter which kind of like tries to tell you, okay, how much are you allowed to change this? How much plasticity this neuron should have,
Right.
and how much stable. So if the neurons are early in the network, which learn like more primitive things, those should be more stable, right? Because those are learning primitive things like simple shapes, or let's say simple patterns. But as you like keep on adding on top with hierarchical, towards the end it becomes more task specific, and those should be more plastic. So those should
Mm,
be change as, so with the new task it should change.
right.
And
Okay, fascinating. Because for the last 4 or 5 years, I've actually been thinking about this issue of like novelty versus safety, and which seems to be kind of embedded in all these kind of questions. Now it's getting talked about as explore and exploit and things like that. And there just seem to be all kinds of overlapping areas where this comes up. And yeah, I mean, the stability to plasticity dilemma, that's one reason I talked about it, because there's all these Goldilocks zones, right? Where you kind of have, and complexity science talks about this, it's like, uh, and that's actually related to the health stuff that I'm working on. I'll get to that in a second, actually. But I wanted to ask you about Stoicism and Buddhism. Like, how did you get into those, and what was your journey like? Were you reading the
yeah,
Stoics, or?
for me, stoicism just immediately made sense. Like, yeah, this is how it should be. I don't know. I've talked about this with some friends as well. I think for some people, they just naturally gravitate towards stoicism, and some people just don't. Like, this is not even about logic or trying to convince them. Like, I've tried to convince so many people with like so many different kinds of argument, right, why stoicism makes sense. But for some people it just, even if it makes sense to them, they will be like, this is so depressing. I mean, it's not depressing, it's I've been trying to, but
So
yeah.
like meditating on death and things like that, or?
No, not even that. It's just that there are some things you cannot change in life, and you
Right.
need to accept that, right? And you need to understand what you can change and what you cannot change. Draw a boundary, and then only worry about things you can change.
Right. So that's Epictetus, the dichotomy of control, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
So those kind of things, and so yeah, that's how I just, I didn't read like anything, one of the books like end to end. I think I read the letters
Right.
from that one, and
Seneca,
yeah, letters from Seneca, and then a few like there is one more, I forgot now.
Marcus
It's
Aurelius,
a handbook. It's not a very famous book. Like, it's just like, okay, simple. This I read because I wanted to like preach stoicism. I
okay.
forgot the name. It didn't work, so I didn't even bother.
Yeah,
I couldn't. I don't think you can preach stoicism,
right. It's people either have to like it already or not, or
right? And then I was thinking, okay, are there some philosophies which are easy to preach, or and some which are not? Like, you have to get it or you don't.
that's funny. Yeah, actually, it's funny because when I spoke to Derek Sivers about this, I'm not sure if you know him, but he's written several books recently. And I had read Anything You Want, and when I talked to him, or maybe he said it in a podcast or something like that. But it was just that Stoicism was like the philosophy that he had before he realized that like philosophy was a thing, basically. And so it was like just naturally in there. And then when he finally read it, he was like, "Oh, I totally get this." And I find like a lot of Stoic wisdom like really helpful, and I actually it appeals to me. Although there are parts of it that I don't like find that easy. But on the whole, I found it like super helpful. I think I first read the Meditations, like Marcus Aurelius, in my early 20s, maybe. And there's been a few times that I've read it since then, and found it really good. I read Epictetus, I think just the Golden Sayings or something like that. And that's very good as well. It's nice because they're like opposite ends of the pole. Marcus Aurelius is like an emperor, and Epictetus is like a slave. But slaves could do slightly. Our image of what a slave is like slightly different from what they were at what Roman slaves were like. And then I only recently read a little bit of Seneca, and he didn't appeal to me as much. I know some people really love him, but like he feels a bit too preachy for me. Whereas like there's something about the privacy of Marcus Aurelius's meditations where he's just talking to himself, so it doesn't feel like he's telling you what to do. Whereas like Seneca's like is it Letters to a Young Stoic or something? Like he's like telling you what to do, and I'm like,
Yeah. Taleb also likes, I think, Aurelius more because he likes the idea of a philosopher king more than a king philosopher. So you should be a king first, and then you become a philosopher, right? Not the other way around. So
that's interesting. And Buddhism, did you have a intense contact with that, or how has that been for you?
not really. My family has, like, my dad has talked about that a lot. So I was always exposed to those ideas growing up, right? And in general, like, I was aware. So Stoicism, for example, I was like, oh shit, this, I kind of think about it naturally, and okay, there is a name for this. But with Buddhism, it was more like, okay, I was aware. Okay, this is what the Buddhists think, and this is what the central ideas are, and stuff like that. But then later on, I think what happened was I was trying to get into meditation, and then it just like just I just couldn't wrap my head around it, right? Like, why? Like, okay, what I'm trying to do, and what's the process? How does it? What happens after? Should I just, like, ego death? Should I just kill myself? Like, how does that figure out? But then, so with that, I just read more practical books. Like, I've never read like actual Buddhist philosophy, right? But I've read like more stuff like, okay, meditation books, like, what's it called? There you Here it is, or here you are, or something like that. It's like a, like, nice Zen koan or something.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
as well a bit.
if you're interested in the sort of practicalities of meditation, The Mind Illuminated is fantastic. I'm not sure if we've talked about that book before,
No, no, we
but
have not.
it's a very practical guide. It tells you what it's all about. It tells you the kind of split between concentration and insight. And it kind of breaks it up into these like 10 stages. It's just an amazing manual. If it just answers so many questions.
Wow, this is what I was looking for.
Yeah. Like there's many great books on Buddhism, the kind of as a philosophy, but in terms of like practical guide, here's what you do from like really basic, how do I set up a practice and even get through the first 10 minutes all the way down to these like very, super advanced like things you might encounter very far down the path. It's I think it's probably the best book that I've encountered on the practicalities of meditation.
Okay, that's next on my list then, because I've been looking for this meditation book.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's funny because yeah, so just to go into a little of mine, like I encountered Buddhism like maybe 5 or 6 years ago. And I started meditating like just through Headspace before I got into any deep philosophy or anything like that. Like I was a little curious about what was going on, so I took this course that Robert Wright did. He wrote this book, Why Buddhism is True, and he also did like a Coursera course, which was very good, just giving the kind of basic tenets of Buddhism. Because before that, I just didn't know at all what it was about. Unlike you, I didn't. It was not in the air for me, you know. But the when I first encountered some of the basic ideas, like, life is suffering, suffering is caused by desire, these kind of things, immediately, just like with Stoicism, they really resonated. But
Mm,
what's kind of interesting is that even though that's true, and I find like I really have gotten a lot from Stoicism, from Buddhism, from Epicureanism, and from other like philosophical trajectories. The one that like really is me, like that really sums me up is Taoism. And that was something that I encountered when I was sort of about, I must have been like 19 or something, 18 or 19. I
okay.
first read the Tao Te Ching, and it just blew my mind. That book is like it's very short and it's like very cryptic. I mean, do you know anything about Taoism or?
Yeah, I do, but very little. I know about that book,
Yeah.
and how when you explain the Tao, is it even Tao?
Yeah.
Things like things like that, and non-duality. I think that explores, takes non-duality to its like the peak, right? But
Yeah.
can you give me a quick summary as well?
A quick summary of Taoism. So, yeah, I mean, I think what you're referring to is the very opening of the Tao Te Ching, which just says it's like this joke. Like the Tao Te Ching is supposed to have like 5,000 characters. I think it's not exactly 5,000, but it's like a really short number. And it starts out with this very cryptic thing, which says like, it's translated in different ways. And if you're going to read it in English, which I guess most people would, then there are like hundreds of translations, literally, like, and many of them are very good, but they're all like completely different. Sometimes you get to a passage and you're like, were they even reading the same like text? And part of the issue is that ancient Chinese has like these very many characters that are ambiguous. And there's also not, I think there's like not really, they're on these scrolls. So there's sometimes doubt about where the like, you know, sentences end, and they mean completely different things because there's like overlap between nouns and verbs and things like that. And so the opening line says, it's something like, the Tao that can be talked about is not the eternal Tao, or the Tao that can be spoken of is not the true Tao, something like that. But the funny thing is that the word for speak is also Tao in Chinese, or in ancient Chinese. So it's like Tao, it's like Tao that Tao not Tao. There's like, it's like a very like really cryptic, you know, like small chunk. So it's very paradoxical, which appeals to me. And it also, it kind of, implicit in it is that there's sort of, you know, the yin and yang thing is very much a part of Taoism, like the idea that there's times to be sort of rigid, there's times to be fluid, there's times, you know, and that it's a very adaptive and philosophy with a lot of emphasis on spontaneity and emphasis on lived practice over concepts. So in a way, it's quite what would now be called a pragmatist philosophy, which is just to say that what matters in practice, like experience is always going to trump theory, right? If you keep getting the wrong result, like you were saying at the beginning with, you know, your thesis, if you have this great theory and it looks amazing on paper, but none of the experiments bear that out, you have to get rid of the theory. You can't get rid of the actual experience, right? So the experience always has to win. And that's one reason I think Taoism appealed to me when I first came across it. And the other text that is alongside the Tao Te Ching is the Zhuangzi, and that's written later. It's very unclear exactly how old the Tao is, I think, but it's known to be very old. They found, I think it's like only in the last like 30 or 40 years, they found a really old copy from like 200 BC or something like that of the Tao, which kind of affected everything, you know, all the understanding of how old it was and things like that. I don't know the exact details, but Zhuangzi is writing, like, I think he's alive in like 312 BC, something like that. And so he comes to be considered a Taoist philosopher, but at the time, like Confucius also writes about the Tao. Tao just means way or path, and everything in ancient Chinese philosophy and or everything that we have now, because a lot of it was destroyed in the sort of 2nd century BC, refers to the Tao. So even the idea that Taoism is a thing is like, that comes a few hundred years later, and there's a lot of revision going on in the first few centuries AD. But I think there's like a couple reasons why it really appealed to me. One is actually like quite personal. So I'm a type 1 diabetic, and I think from early on, I dealt with a lot of doctors because I was diagnosed, you know, when I was like 2 years old. And so I was always in hospital. I was always having these problems. I was always having to deal with like medical issues. And one thing I realized is that, like, I was very independent. I wanted to learn all about how to manage my, you know, illness, because it requires, you know, I now have an insulin pump, but it used to require like, you know, 4 injections a day or something like that. And so from the age of 7, I was giving these, and they require like lots of calculations, right? You need to know what your blood sugar is. You need to know how many carbohydrates you've had. You need to know how much exercise you've had. And then you have to come up with a dosage, and then, you know, see what works. Now, one thing I kept like encountering was like, doctors would tell you their theory of like how your blood sugar should work. And they'd be like, no, you just need to do this and like it'll work, you know? And so they had this, they came at it from this very rationalist perspective, which is like a great starting place. I have absolutely nothing against science and nothing against, these having these theories in advance, and of course those are also informed by the practice of others. But until you've actually like tried to live with type 1 diabetes, like you are not gonna know how to manage it. And so from a very early age, I think I had this intense kind of, I wouldn't say like anti-theoretical, but I just knew that, yeah, it's things that are very nice in theory often go wrong in practice, And
Yeah.
so like the philosophies that appealed to me were ones that put practice, not they put practice above theory, I would say. Not to say that you don't take the practice and then go and reflect on it and learn from it and incorporate it into a new theory, because if just every time you have a problem you just kind of deal with it in the moment and you don't use that to reflect or kind of do a broader learning, which I think it's very possible to do. Like I've been in patterns with diabetes where it's like, oh, this thing keeps happening, but I don't actually do anything about it. And so I think that's what I was answering one of your first questions, like when is the rationalist move the correct one? Well, once you've had experience and you want to integrate that into like a worldview, then you need to do that step. But then the only point in having this kind of theoretical framework that's now informed by that experience is to go out and do stuff again, like as in re-encounter experience with the updated model, you know what I mean? And so
Yes.
like it's almost like, and that is Taoist at its heart, which is basically saying there's a kind of swinging back and forth, almost like a pendulum. And if you go too far in the abstract direction, you'll just lose, all contact with reality, which we frankly, we see that all the time with,
Yeah.
you know, theorizing, rationalism. We get stuck in these modes of forgetting that we're looking at the map and not the territory, and basically saying, well, this is what should work, and ignoring the fact that it's not working in practice, right? I mean, we can think of examples where that's happened in medicine or nutrition or all kinds of things. And then you could also have the opposite failure mode where you have taken a lot of action, but you actually don't really understand, like you haven't really gotten any understanding of like the principles behind things. And I'm absolutely not denying that there are like, there's often like just like a good rule of thumb. I feel like Taleb, writes about that. And so that is like detection of some underlying principle. If there were no principles, then you would just have to react to everything as it comes in and there would be no point in rationality. But that's not true, right? Like we need kind of both. And I could go on about that, but like, I don't know. Do you it just
No. It makes total sense, right? That you but the thing is, you should start with experience, and experience should inform the theory, not the other way around, right? That's the key insight here.
Yeah, and I think to go back to, I was calling it the health model of inquiry in some of these videos, and when we were at Flix, there was like this confusion around that because I think when you say health, people assume that you are talking about like the healthcare system or something like that. Where I was talking about more like biological, like homeostasis, right? Which is that we have a body temperature and it has a range. And if it goes too high, we encounter one kind of problem. If it goes too low, we encounter a different kind of problem. And so it's just like many things in health are like that, right? Like blood pressure, heart rate. I mean, you could, almost everything has a kind of range. And sometimes it's very narrow, like, well, it depends how you define narrow, I guess, but like blood pH, if it varies like almost at all, you're like really in trouble. Whereas blood sugar, like it can actually, from what would be normal for you, I could go to half or a quarter or even like a tenth and still survive and not have like not die. If I went to like 100th, I would probably die. And I can also go 10 times as high, or if I went, I would probably go into a coma at 100 times as high. But like, you know what I mean? Like there's a bigger range. Whereas blood pH, it's like, well, but again, I guess it depends how you define the scale. But like if we define this pH range, it's really narrow what you can be in. And yet there is still a kind of like Goldilocks zone. And what I think is important in relating this to Taoism is that, and to health, like in health, it's not the case that you just have one system, like let's say you have like a way of increasing metabolism or something. Usually there's like there's like there's a sympathetic and a parasympathetic nervous system, and like one actively, you know, amps you up and the other actively relaxes you. I'm sure someone who's, you know, studied biology is like, what you're saying is not right. But like, but I know that this is the case for like the heart, let's say, like if you, there's one mechanism to speed it up and one to slow it down. But what's interesting is that they're both active mechanisms. So they're not, it's not like you just kind of, you know, like a sous vide or something where you only can heat it and then it goes down. It's more like, and it's not really like an air, you know, like you could imagine like a heating air conditioning system. But the problem with that is like that keeps bounds by like only turning on one when you go outside the range. And I think like what's important about thinking about health is that it's actually like a dynamic equilibrium situation. So like
Yeah.
you're
Yes.
always pushing kind of both directions at once in order to maintain this fixed, very narrow in some cases range, even through movement. You know, it's not, you know, now we think, oh, uh, now we sort of seem to think of like being still as the normal state, but like probably for most of history, being in motion is the normal state. But like
Yes.
to stay in motion and keep all these parameters very fine tuned requires like sort of active effort on in two directions at once. And
Yes.
that's what I'm kind of like trying to argue is that like you kind of have to be it sounds a bit paradoxical and it probably is, but like it's like you need to be actively investigating and then like actively, you know, relaxing or learning or reflecting. They're both active somehow, even though you might, I mean, and of course you need rest. But rest, you know, being asleep and being awake is like also a good, I like that way of thinking about things because, you know, I think in our like modern day and age, we have a tendency to want these systems where basically we just have a kind of, now we've understood it in this like epistemological, you know, like rational. It's based on knowledge, and now that we understand it, we're done, right? And that like that impulse, I think, is actually wrong. Like it actually needs to be more like sleeping and waking. Like maybe, yeah, we're more active when we're awake, but we also need to sleep. They're just like totally interlinked. And the same thing I would say with kind of like framework building and then testing in practice, which I don't think like, when I say it that way, it doesn't sound controversial, but like there are times when I get more into the teleological and causality and other things like that, it I don't know. I suppose it sounds a little bit weirder.
No, what clicked it for me is the word when you said dynamic equilibrium. Like that just clicked for me. You know, like yes, dynamic because you're actually pushing from both ends. It's not what you said. It's not that okay, one time you push and then once you go too much, then the other starts to push. And ideally, you would not want to do any. But no, you're actually trying to actively do both of these things at the same time, and it's dynamic, right? It's not like you're done balancing and that's it, but no, you're like always have to keep the balance going from both ends.
Yeah, and I mean, it's funny because maybe that is just me being a diabetic, where I'm like, oh, like you know, I eat food, then my blood sugar goes up, and then I like take insulin, and my blood sugar goes down, and it's like always this, just trying to strive to stay in that balance. Like, so maybe all of, you know, the stuff that I'm thinking about just kind of ultimately derives from this basic physiological issue that I have. But I'm not really sure, but yeah, there's this idea of allostasis. Have you heard of that?
No.
Um, it's like this idea that homeostasis kind of has this image that it's like a balancing act, and that's what I'm trying to kind of say, that balance is the wrong framework, because we think, you know, like when you think of like, I mean, I guess maybe, yeah, like if you're talking about balancing on one leg, that's like, I think we all know that's a very active process. If you know,
Yeah.
if you try to do that for any amount of time, it's very active. But the problem with the word balance for me is like it implies like a scale. Like you could just kind of like, maybe you just need to put a few things on this scale and then it'll balance out and you can just leave it. But that's not the kind of thing I'm talking about. Like, you know what I mean? Like, in fact, it's more like allostasis, which is like not just homeostasis where we kind of balance out these two, this variable within this range, but that actually that variable is intrinsically tied to many other variables within the body and within the environment and within the social circle. And so it's in this really complex tension, and yet it still must remain in that range through motion and interaction and, sort of internal processes like social processes and all these other things. Do you know what I mean? Like homeostasis just implies like, oh, it's just like we
This
balance.
is exactly what I was saying. With it's the difference is static equilibrium and dynamic equilibrium, right? It's not like a scale that you put things in and then okay, let's not. The thing then is okay, we should not touch it anymore, and it should stay this way, right? The more we touch, the more we'll disturb the balance. But with like standing on one leg, you have to continuously monitor, right? And you have to keep on like okay, this way, this way, this way, and then it just you have to be actively like participating in that kind of like balance.
Yeah, so balancing on one leg, I think, is the right framework. Balancing a scale is not the right framework when we think about rationality versus experience. The other thing that might interest you, so yeah, as you know, I've been doing sort of lots of digging through philosophy. I just finished Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morality, and then that relates a lot to his other work. And so he's got this idea that, and I think it probably does start with him because other people have gone down this route too, which is that we all have this story, right? That something really incredible happened in ancient Athens. At least in the West, we have this story. And like, what is that thing that happened? And I think Nietzsche is kind of the source for this idea that what's going on is there's like, I mean, he probably doesn't have this concept. I'm sure he doesn't have this concept. This is a more recent concept about the late Bronze Age collapse, where all these cultures come into contact with each other. No one knows exactly what's happening, but there's all between like about 3000 BC and I think 1100 BC is often given as a date. There's all this like cultural contact and then all these collapses occurring. And so you've got this kind of chaotic situation, and there's and that goes all the way from, there's instances of it happening in China all the way, North Africa, Greece, all over, there's not much going on in Northern Europe at that time, as far as I'm aware, in part because, yeah, anyway, that it's without getting into that, like his idea is that like what's going on in Greece is like, because he's got this idea of Apollonian and Dionysian, right?
Okay.
And this is like kind of like what, again, like explore, exploit, kind of, Dionysian.
Create and destroy, right?
Yeah, exactly. Or yin and yang, right? Which is like the Apollonian is like the kind of rule-based, order-based, we're gonna like, set up these categories. It's the rationalist one, right? And the Dionysian is like, we're gonna blow it up. It's chaotic. It's like all over the place. It's like crazy explore. And I think his idea, and I think this is like I could be wrong, and anyone who's a Nietzsche scholar will hopefully correct me in the comments or something like that. But I think it's in Birth of Tragedy, where he's basically saying, look, what's unique about Greece is not that it's like wildly creative. It's that it kind of introduces this right level of tension. So it introduces like the Apollonian into a Dionysian situation, which is that he wasn't talking about the late Bronze Age collapse, but he's talking about, going from Homer, which is a very different model, and then into the pre-Socratics. It's kind of like, if you think about it in terms of like entropy, right? And again, these Goldilocks zones, right? You could think of, I gave the example of like a star, which is too, like, or a star is a kind of Goldilocks zone. If you've got all this matter and it's too entropic, it's like basically it's just kind of not binding together, then it's like too chaotic to like, if there's not enough mass, it will just remain this chaos. But then if there is enough mass, it'll coalesce into this self-reinforcing, like autopoietic process, a bit like life, right? Where it kind of, all this gas comes together and then it starts this process that reinforces itself. But if there's too much mass, then it collapses down into like a neutron star or a black hole or something like that. And so you've got this kind of bounded situation. And, we talked about bounds within health as well, which is that, your blood pH is like well, that one can't move very much, but blood sugar, there might be, or another example I gave is body temperature, which is like there might be situations where even though there's a cost to raising your body temperature, there's also a benefit, right? So in a
When you
fever,
go sick, for example.
yeah, a fever might be worth it sometimes, right? And
Mhm.
meanwhile, I think when you're starving, you can shut down certain body processes, and your typical your body temperature can drop if necessary. Like it's just like, and then you have other risks on that side, of course. But like, you know what I mean? So there's like a kind of a situation where you have a bit of like room to move around in.
Mhm. Mhm.
And what you could say is that, and I don't want to like misrepresent him, but like you could say that Nietzsche's view is that you're starting out with this Dionysian situation, which is just really, really chaotic societies.
Mhm.
And the introduction of order, and I think this is why all the early lawmakers, which is something that I'm going to get into in more detail later, are considered so important. And I actually don't think that they're like top-down geniuses who basically, figure out what the first principles of law are. It's
Yeah.
probably just tons of random experiments, and the ones that end up working, those guys are remembered because they need to be imitated, because that's what happens when something successfully works in practice. You have to imitate it. Like you actually don't have to quote unquote understand it. And you don't, they may be attributed with wisdom, but they're attributed with wisdom after the fact, after their ideas work, not before. And so, but like, I think the idea here is just that the Apollonian it's almost like the society is like too chaotic, and then bringing that order in produces this like explosion of flourishing. And then it almost goes too far. By the time of Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, it's already kind of like too cool, and it's like too rigid. And arguably, like even Alexander the Great, like we love all those guys because we live in a society that's even more crazily ordered than theirs was. But in the whole scheme of, if you look into kind of many other societies over time, what already the Greeks are like crazy, weird, ordered, and we're even further along that Apollonian spectrum, right? Even though we might not think so, we might think very chaotic, but if you just read history, it's like we're in one of the most like
Well,
constricted, you know,
bureaucratic system, right? There's everything
yeah,
and everything, and it's like whole global system of rules, and it's impossible to escape society now.
yeah, and we've all been brought under this kind of system of intense rules, even though just the amount of like bureaucracy, paperwork that each of us goes through, like, there's a reason that old people are like, what the hell is happening? Because they just didn't have this. I mean, like 100 years ago, 120 years ago, passports didn't exist, which is like, it's such a clearly, like we get so used to things so quickly. Like, I mean, like 30 years ago, online forums didn't exist. You know what I mean? Like, and yet, like it becomes hard for us to imagine, but it's like, I think it's really, this is one of the reasons that I'm going to try and argue that like a knowledge of history and anthropology is like critical to what I'm talking about. It's not just coming up with, your sort of rationalist frameworks and theories and then applying them in practice. That's a huge important part, especially if you're not in the practice already, like you were saying, of testing your models against reality, or ideally going out there and doing some experiments before you even get a kind of prediction, right? But there's also huge lessons to be learned in history and anthropology, and like if we don't sort of engage with that, to me it's like it's kind of crazy. It's like,
Why would you think so? Because history. So we were talking about this. Remember that how if you want to know about some idea, you need to know the context of where that idea or that philosophy comes from, right? So what you're essentially saying is by studying anthropology or like history, you basically get the lineage of why and where it came from, and that informs you much more than just studying the idea in its abstract form.
yeah, so that is one thing that I've definitely argued, and that's a Nietzschean move as well. It's kind of, you could also call it Darwinian, which is like you can't understand a perfected concept or organism. This whole issue of perfection is a complicated one in biology, but let's just say if you can't understand the hand, like how it evolved by just looking at it and seeing what it does. You actually have to understand its genealogy, really. And the
Okay.
same goes for concepts. So yeah, I have talked about that, but I'm actually talking about something slightly different.
I want to interject here quickly, right? Okay, this gave me another idea. Like, if you want to understand a code base, if you just study the code base, you'll never be able to understand why some decisions were made. You need to know at the commit history. You need to know the whole. Okay, something crazy happened at some point, and these guys left. But then all of those like accumulated knowledge is so the reason we are doing things this way. There is some particular reasoning behind. Like, there's some history behind that. And just by looking at the code in its current form, you'll never be able to get the full why this is happening or how. But
I
yeah.
really like that. So it's about like path dependence in a code base, right?
Yeah, like code commit histories, right? Or like code bases. Like even there we have this saying, right, that you cannot build a complex system from scratch. It has to like evolve. You cannot build a complete code base in one go. Like even Linux was built using scaffolding. So Linus Torvalds started with Unix and started replacing small bits and parts with his code, and the whole it just stayed as a skeleton, and then slowly removed the skeleton when Linux was done. And
Mm.
even now you can see some of the way things are being done. You can see the crutch. Okay, this was because this was done this way in Unix, but now it's not even needed, but still there because this is the whole history of the evolution of that piece of software.
Yeah. So it's not just path dependence. I love what you said because it's like you're getting rid of the scaffolding that you use to erect the thing. And I
Yes.
see this all the time in human affairs and in biology, actually, which is that nature very often kicks out the ladder from underneath it. This is a phrase that Wittgenstein uses at the end of the Tractatus, but it happens a lot of times in. For a few years ago, I was studying plant evolution, which like is much longer than animal evolution, and I kept noticing this that there's like basically the way that it's understood that photosynthesis develops or whatever. It's like the thing that caused it to be that way is no longer there and no longer even possible, but like nature has had to go down this route and then kind of just paper over the fact that this is like not the best way to do things, basically. And so it's
Exactly.
all super path dependent, and often it depended on the environmental conditions. So like one would be, this great oxygenation event where, you can actually, it opens up this whole new form of, aerobic respiration, which is like much more efficient way of using energy. But that whole thing was like kind of, it was kicked off by anaerobic organisms, and of course some of these still do exist, so to say they all went extinct is an exaggeration, but for like a billion years all the photosynthesis has happened, or even more, it must be even more, is happening on these cyanobacteria that are anaerobic. They can't tolerate the presence of oxygen, but they're releasing oxygen as a waste product, and in the end the oxygen kills them, right? And so, but that's what produces this atmosphere that now allows the next thing to evolve and evolve like in a way that looks, that it, because through evolution, looks perfectly suited to this oxygenic, atmosphere, which is the opposite of the reducing atmosphere that existed before. And so when you look at that, you think, well, look how beautiful this kind of respiration is. It uses the natural state of oxygen, and but the thing is, like, there's nothing natural about the amount of oxygen that is here. It was produced by life as a waste product of anaerobic respiration that was going on for billions of years, and those things actually like killed themselves like not intentionally, but like this like gives you true insight into what evolution means, because it's a cool enough temperature in single-celled organisms where you're not going into human cultural evolution or something like that. But this is how it works in the code base, or in cultural evolution, or in the biological domain, is that it kicks out the ladder, it rewrites the history, and so in the end you think, oh well, this all makes sense and it all lines up, but you haven't seen that both like the question and the solution have evolved to suit each other. So
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like the
Extreme,
environment
like
has
back,
changed.
yeah, it's it's
Yeah.
it's part of the environment. You cannot just take it out and just study it. Reductionism, like you cannot just pick it out and then study it separately without studying its effect, how it was affected, and how it did affect the environment, and the whole process is, it's all part of it.
Exactly. And so that's why I think that the history of ideas is like very important. The history, but I was actually making a slightly different point before just about the importance of studying history and anthropology, because I think we have a tendency to think, well, we face unprecedented problems. And many of us, like I would say that I'm probably in that category, that I'm like, well, this is totally unprecedented. And in some ways, what we face today is totally unprecedented. I mean, taking it to the extreme, every moment of any kind is always unprecedented, right? It's always unique. You listen to the same song two times in a row, and it's still, your brain has changed, the environment's changed, the time of the day has changed, and all these other things. But even without going to that extreme, like what I'm saying is that I assumed that, it wasn't just like the specific, elements that were unique, but something about like the past was kind of irrelevant to the problems that we're solving today. But I no longer think that's true. Like I basically think it's really important to know history and to know that many of these things have been tried before, like, and many of these patterns have gone on before, even right now, you could say that there's a questioning of science. I was just tweeting about this today. That also happened in like the 40s and 50s. There's this whole reaction against what was called scientism, that it was like damaging society in this certain way. You could say that right now there's a kind of reinvigorating interest in religion or in astrology or things like that. But that's all of these things have happened before, and they almost happen in like patterns. And it's like, I think that, like, there are a few. I mean, you can go too far in that direction and just think, oh well, I feel like structural anthropology or Spengler, or kind of like imitating Gibbon, is basically saying, all these societies have like they kind of have this glorious youth, and then they go into, then they become dominant, and then they go into decline and decadence and stuff like that. And I don't think that that's necessarily so useful, but like, I do think it's interesting to think about like why these patterns occur. I mean, I've spoken about it recently a few times, but there's a book called Anti-Intellectualism in American Life by Richard Hofstadter, and he's writing in the 60s. Have you read it?
No, I've heard of it. Carl Sagan used to, or somebody used to reference this book a lot.
Oh,
Anti.
it's so good. It's so good. And he's writing in the 60s, and you're like, "Oh my God, this could be written right now," for like this kind of question of when expertise and intellectuals come in and come to be seen as like important, and like holding important knowledge and consequential and things like that. And then there's this kind of backlash, and he thinks that in the US there's a kind of more extreme pattern of that process than there are in other countries where, you know, I mean, you could say in Britain, for example, like the NHS is kind of like, it's sort of beyond question. There's no one that's going to like come out and say, why are we trusting all these experts anyway, or something like that. Whereas in the US, that does happen. And so, and I'm just using that as an example of like one book which takes this approach, which is like to say, why don't we look at the last like 300 years and see when we've been in similar situations? And that's the kind of like that in this case, that's what I'm saying, like the importance of history and also anthropology, because anthropology gives you insights into what cultures who like don't have any of your assumptions about how things work, what's important, like how to live. And they may have faced similar problems and actually come up with even better solutions than you would ever think of if you had never encountered them. And I would also say that, in a lot of cases, these cultures, especially if they've had only very limited contact with other, with the West, let's say, then they may have practices that have been developed through processes of cultural evolution over like, tens of thousands, or even, tens of thousands of years, let's say. And I was reading this book, Triumph of the Nomads, and this was written in the 70s. It's a kind of controversial book about Aboriginal Australians. And the author is controversial for good reason. His name's Jeffrey Blaney. But one of the interesting things is that he argues that one of the last big influxes of like new drugs into Western medicine was just from guys writing down what plant medicines Aboriginal Australians use, because they have no qualms. I mean, like, not that they have no qualms. It's better to say over the course of cultural evolution, people will just eat things randomly, and that happens
Yes.
everywhere. It's not restricted to Australia. But like, the only way to know whether something is poisonous or not is somebody's got to eat it, right? And
So,
maybe there's some kind of pattern over time, but like that gets ingrained in some kind of cultural knowledge. And also, but so does the flip side, which is like, oh, this is good for this sickness. And we don't really have that ability anymore to like test drugs at least like that randomly over that many period of iterations and that amount of time. Like, you could think of like,
mm,
if you think about, it's now thought that Aboriginal Australians arrived like 50,000 years ago, and pretty much were like we're pretty much cut off from the rest of the world for most of that time. So if you think about like how expensive a randomized control trial is, but it can, how many people does it have? Like a few hundred or something like that, or maybe thousands, or but you can't imagine that it has like thousands of generations, right?
exactly.
But
Yeah.
like, that knowledge has thousands of generations behind it, and it's actually got this selective process, and we see it produce insanely ingenious solutions, just as biological evolution produces insanely ingenious evolutions. All these things about um,
But
like having
mm,
dozens of steps to like make a certain food safe to eat or something like that. You know what I mean? And it's like they've just figured it out by trial and error, but
yeah.
like no one could figure it out. And Joseph Henrik and Michael Muti Krishna wrote a paper about this, the cultural niche, and they're talking about like Europeans with like a huge amount of money behind them kept going into like trying to cross the outback in Australia or trying to get to the poles or something like that. And they just invariably died every time, no matter how much science they had,
Mhm.
unless they asked people who actually lived there, like, how do you live? Like, and so
Yeah, exactly,
in
exactly.
those
It's
cases, like they could actually survive, like, and so that was a big difference apparently between like Amundsen, who I think was like Norwegian or something, and like the English. The English were just like, we'll just go in with horses and we know everything about everything, and then they would always just die basically. Whereas like other nations were like, maybe we should ask the people who live here, and they would survive. And so it's like, I don't know.
this is the thing. Now that you said, like on a tangent, this is the thing in, like, I'm getting kind of interested into geopolitics these days, and one of the whole field of geopolitics kind of, I'm just learning, so maybe I'm wrong, rests on this idea that geography is destiny. So every nation or every country or every region has a certain geographical patterns, and everything else is basically to deal with that, to solve that problem, or to use that. And every generation, civilization, nation states, people that live there basically always solve or somehow try to live in that particular case, or live with those constraints or with those boundaries or with those natural resources or those natural calamities. So that's the constant. It's always, and you just kind of like evolve around that, but it always stays the same. You can always consider that as constant no matter what changes.
And do you think that's right? I'm just curious. I don't know much about it.
From what I'm seeing now, especially the Russia Ukraine war, so many people gave lots of like reasons behind it, right? That why Russia would do this, and because Putin is evil and all that and all that. But according to geopolitics, it's a very straightforward reason. Even it's this is, I think, taught in Russian schools as well, that they have this theory that, okay, Russia is the heartland and they need access to the sea. They need to protect their borders, right? And the whole of like the eastern, like the European part, basically is unflanked, so it's very hard to protect themselves. They're very hard to border, and they have to move outward to survive. They have to move towards like Ukraine, Poland, because Poland is flatland, and there are like very few choke points there. You have to get to the Alps, only then Russia is secure. And this problem has always existed with Russia, so it's nothing about Putin, it's nothing about US. It's nothing about the current situation. It's always been like this. Like Russia has to expand outwards to live. And same with like China, right? Like that part, the river and the Han Chinese, and that part is the most densely populated regions in the world, right? And the northern Indian plains, those like high amounts of agriculture, you can produce loads amount of food, and so much civilization and culture happens in those regions that is fixed. Basically, it's constant. So, I there is some appeal to these ideas.
Yeah.
Uh, also, this is a very interesting thing is that the culture of UK, which is an island nation, is so much similar to Japanese, which is also an island nation and also has a continental. They keep fighting with China, North Korea, and they develop these similar like knights, samurais, feudal systems in both sides. So in a way, geography is like it really has a huge impact.
Mhm. That's fascinating. So where were you reading this or
This is Peter Zion. This guy is amazing. He's writing these books called like so he's written books about U.S. the accidental superpower, and there's also this book absent superpower, which is basically in refers in regarding to U.S. His whole thesis is based behind deglobalization, how after World War II and Cold War, U.S. established this whole globalized economy because it helped them. Now it doesn't serve the U.S. as much, so they are ready to let the whole globalized system fall apart, and like it's pulling back wherever it can, where it doesn't serve its interests anymore. He has written a new book now. It's called "The End of the World is Just the Beginning," and
will you
it's
send me,
nice.
will you send me his name or put it
Yes.
in the chat?
Private, yes, yes. There you go.
Okay, Peter Cyan. Interesting. Yeah, and we didn't really get into the Buddhist dependent origination thing, but I'll just try and give like a quick teaser about that. Like this is against the kind of normal understanding of causality, and there are other philosophers, including Hume, Schopenhauer kind of goes along with him, and Nietzsche, who also question whether causality exists anywhere
Mhm.
outside the mind, right?
Mm.
And this is like it's a very hard one to grapple with because we were talking about, we think forms of bureaucracy are just like absolutely normal, or just to have like a smartphone feels like the most obvious thing in the world, even though it's very new. And other things that you learn much earlier, like causal relationships to things, are even harder to really question or even think about.
Mhm.
But it might be, and yeah. So like where I'm going with this is like the Buddha has this understanding that of dependent origination, which is basically this chain. It's kind of like a complex web of conditions that it's like a complex set of interdependencies, like we've talked about, like a bit like in software, it's like
Yeah.
dependency hell, right? Where
Yes.
if these are all present, then suffering can arise. But it's like if you can get rid of one of them, then suffering can't exist. And so the kind of most fundamental one is ignorance. But it is interesting to just think of like removing a library or something and the software won't run, basically.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Just to get rid of any module. It doesn't matter which module, and it's not going to work. And so, but then in this view, like it's like dependent origination is often taught as this kind of cosmic thing because the last two steps in it are birth and like aging, suffering, death. Are so like birth and death are the last two steps, which always confused people, which made them think that maybe there's like a multiple lifetime kind of understanding, that it's about reincarnation because there's these 10 steps that come before birth.
Mm.
But there's a kind of understanding that comes out of Theravada Buddhism, and certain Westerners are using it now, which is a moment by moment interpretation of dependent origination. And it's basically saying that the birth that comes about is self view. So basically, like in order for like a kind of ego view to arise in the moment, and on this understanding that there's not really a true self, and there's just or there's nothing you can point to that's a stable true self. And so things are kind of like constantly arising. And in this view, like the last step is that there's like an I that comes up, that like I don't like this tweet or something. But
Uh,
all these things had to come about. And there's also like a rewriting of history at each stage to make it look as if the tweet caused the pain. But in fact, there's all these other conditions that have to be met. So like you kind of have to be primed in many ways for something like a tweet to be able to cause you pain. For example, you have to read the tweet. You also have to like have a concept of what a tweet is. You have to understand who is tweeting it. You know, like there's like loads of things that go that are kind of like preconditions for this. But the end result is so persuasive that it rewrites its own history as if it's this simple causality between one thing and the other. In fact,
hmm.
it's kind of like almost like a dream. So like, and Nietzsche is looks at this in a different way, but like I'm going to be doing at some point a look at this paper by this guy Jonathan Hillis Miller, who is working. He's one of he was one of associated with Derrida at the Yale school, kind of doing deconstruction. And I might have told you about this before. Nietzsche, like his understanding is, if you imagine like you're asleep in a room and a book falls and you're dreaming, right? And someone drops a book in the room. And then in your dream a gunshot goes off and therefore you're afraid. And so you understand the causality to be the gun caused the fear. But in fact, what's happened is a sound has caused physiological arousal. The physiological arousal has caused maybe fear, and then the fear requires a step backward to
Yeah.
like actually say what's caused it. And within the dream, that's a gunshot. What Nietzsche is saying is that all perception works this way. So basically, anything that you feel operates in this way. It's an inference. It goes backwards and it says what must have caused this. So it's
Mhm.
almost like detective work. And this is also what dependent origination does. It allows you to like say, okay, I'm in this situation of suffering. Like, what must have happened? And it's a bit like going into like, you know, after buildings burned down and been like, okay, what's happened here? You know, like obviously something's happened. But the way that like causality works in perception, in the Buddhist understanding and Nietzsche's understanding, and this is like the big crazy part of the argument, the way that science progresses or cultural evolution progresses in Kuhn's understanding, like implicitly, like it requires the burning down of the building basically, or like we were talking about before, the kicking out of the ladder.
Mhm.
So you like you can't tell what's happened, and that's a feature, not a bug. Because if it's to persist, it has to seem like it was necessary. And so this, you know, like in this understanding, causality comes out of a need for things to look necessary and not from any simple causal relationship.
Wait, this is blowing my mind. Wait, I need. It is, yeah. With science, you need to, whatever you find out needs to stand by itself. Like basically, what you're trying to do is like, okay, let's take this analogy of dependency hell, and what you're trying to do is you try to make sure that even if you do not use any other library, any other module, it still should work, and only then you're allowed to carry on. And with the next time, you use that as a crutch to build a new tool, but this new tool should do all the work that all the other things have done without even like taking like by itself. It's like more complete, uh completeness
Yes.
completeness basically.
I mean, you could say this about Einstein, right? Which is like, in this view, what's going on is really like a wild Darwinian competition for scientific theories. And the one that works the best, it's not about being true. It's about, does it do what the previous model does in some ways better? And like, does it simplify things basically, you know? So does this simplify compared to the Ptolemaic system? Yes. I mean, like Kuhn spends a long time on this because it actually takes like 200 years for all of the equations to get simpler, because there's all kinds of problems to work out to actually make that simpler. It's a bit like, yeah, I really like your software example, because it's like, let's say you're gonna rewrite an operating system from scratch. Well, first, where are you gonna do that? most likely from an existing operating system. You're not going to like
You cannot, yeah, you
it
cannot.
all the way down, right? And
Exactly.
at the same time, you're going to like one by one replace all these parts, and it's going to be a huge pain in the ass. But in the end, you're going to eventually get there. And at the end, you'll be like, oh, here's this thing. And it hides the fact that it, because the earlier one was also a process of cultural evolution, it hides the fact that it wasn't designed, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Like, and it appears to be designed in a certain way, in the same way that life appears to be designed. It's very like, because we're human and we have intentions and we have like short-term, medium-term, long-term goals, we see teleology everywhere. We see intentionality everywhere. We see faces on the moon. We see faces in the clouds. And that's because it's better to have, you know, false positives than false negatives, right? Because a false negative in that regard, if you mistake, if you think there's not a face where there is a face, you might get killed, right? And if you think there's not intentionality where there is intentionality, you might get killed. So, you know, if you see the broken branches and you think,
okay.
shit, someone's been here, right? And that tendency goes into our understanding not only of nature, but even of, you know, not just of biological evolution, but of cultural evolution as well. Even though that's not the way these things work. It's actually like it's like an inversion to see them as designed for a purpose. They're selected and dynamically fit to a set of constraints, to an environment. But that process is not a top-down one. It's a bottom-up one. And it's important, of course, like, you know, to kind of go back and revise it. But, you know, like in Kuhn's view, that's what's really happening. You know, there's a process of rewriting all the textbooks every time there's a scientific revolution to make it look like there's a linear, progressive, you know, line between Newton and Einstein. In
Yeah.
fact, like if you use the term time or mass or space or any of these basic terms the way Einstein uses them, Newton makes no sense. Basically, it doesn't work that way. You know, like it only works one way, and it has to be kind of like the whole. You have to like rebase the whole commit
Yes.
history basically and squash it all down and say yes, Newton, like, and it makes sense as you know as a, like
The most mind blowing part is that it's a feature. Actually, it's
yeah.
not a bug. For science. It's a feature. That is the most mind blowing part. That because you want scientific, because there is this also heuristic, right? That anything which is simpler and can also explain something, and you have, okay, let's say you have system A which is simpler and can explain something, system B which is complex but can do the same thing as system A, but
Yes.
just because one is simple, we will always prefer the simpler one. And
Yeah.
it's a heuristic, but we want to do it with the whole science thing, and then it's
Well, and this is okay. I'm just gonna say I've never said this out loud before, but what if Occam's razor is just like a Germanic aesthetic preference?
yes, I was getting into the same thing. Like it's a heuristic, right? Why would this be true? Like we do select always that the simpler one is better.
Well, and even the concept of being true, like if nature is not conceptual, if existence is not conceptual, then you know these like you know like you could the Kuhn is saying the reason the Ptolemaic system survives as long as it does is because it actually works. Basically, like you can do all the calculations and it tells you what you need to know for astrology to proceed. And of course, don't forget that the whole reason for all this astronomical stuff is not for science, it's for astrology. That's what's driving all this stuff, you know? And so like
I think this is the thing. Like it's for us. So this Occam's razor is basically for us. It's basically because simpler things are easier for us to remember, easier for us to use. So
yes,
it's
and so they're a better tool, but that
yeah,
doesn't mean that they're more true
no,
because Duhem was working on this problem at the early start of the 20th century. You can generate an infinite number of theories that describe exactly the same data. You know, like you can just put some weird tweak, you know, that means nothing, you know, like if this then that thing on top of your theory, and that's a new theory, right?
yeah,
But you know, like we wouldn't do that, but that's because of what we like. It actually doesn't affect, you know, the predictive power of the original theory, and it may even improve it, right? This is the what was going on with the Ptolemaic system, is that there's just this series of like hacks on top of it. And that's what I'm essentially arguing, right? Which is that like that's an aesthetic preference. It's like, like within code, it's like when you get in and you're like, oh my God, it's such a mess. I don't want to learn the history. I just want to design a new system. And of course you may face a lot of problems there because you don't know the history. You don't know all these other problems that the evolutionary, the evolution of the previous system has solved.
Yeah.
But like there, like at the same time, that it's not always the wrong decision to do that, because sometimes you do want it to be simpler. Like a simpler tool is easier to use, right? And so if you can actually reproduce the old tool
With a simpler tool.
with the simpler stuff, it's basically a process of imitation and not of top-down design, then great, just do it. Like, you could say that these new knives that are based on, like even steel or something like that didn't exist 1,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, whatever. Certainly it didn't exist. Anyway, whenever steel comes about, I assume it's in the last 1,000 years. Like, but it's not like the idea of like a knife is new, right? It's basically just like saying, okay, we want something like kind of like the old knife, but better, right? And there might be all kinds of problems with doing this new method of making it. But that's what I'm kind of arguing, is that like all these tools they're more like knives than they are like, sort of mathematical principles or something like that. Because maths and like certain other like or like chess strategies or something like where it's in like a domain that's actually kind of like rigidly locked, because in those domains, then these principles that we like just apply much better. And whereas in Nate, I do have this kind of working hypothesis that just nature is not conceptual, and so anything that we kind of put on top of it is just like a tool. It's just like a useful tool that, and I'm not saying that they're equally useful. It's not relativist at all, because in order to be useful is like a high bar, right? But yeah, I don't know. That's what I was thinking.
Totally, I get this because I did my bachelor's in computer science, right? And you know this meme, right? That everybody has math envy. So the chemists think the physicists are cool, and the physicists think the mathematicians are the real cool guys. So I think in computer science also, like the people who code, they think, okay, if you can do some maths on top of code, it'd be so fucking cool. Like if you can do some equations on top, that's the real shit, right? But then when I had to switch with like AI and machine learning, I had to do some maths, and then this is my perspective of maths from the outside. It does feel like if you remove all the applications of maths and just maths as maths, it's basically some guys, they come up with the new chess game. They form some rules like, hey, we are not allowed to do this, and I want to call this with this and this with this, and these are some rules, like 3 rules. And other guys just come and then they build like more chess strategies that, yeah, if you play it this way, then this is definitely going to happen, and somebody proves it, and it keeps building up this whole towers abstraction. But the thing is, it's locked. It's very nice environment because somebody who made the base rules of the chess game, they just built it with like 3 rules or like 5, something like that, right? But reality, it doesn't have that feature, right? You cannot.
It doesn't, and I'm gonna try and argue that it doesn't even have Aristotelian logic, which was just a kind of basic assumption for like a few thousand years, But that's like a whole other topic. I think, maybe we can leave it there. Is there anything else you want to say? Any closing comments?
No, I'm good. This was fun.
This is fun. It was really, really good to talk to you. I feel like I made progress. Like, you helped me like think about some things that I just really enjoyed it.
It was really fun. Yeah. Enjoyed it as well.
Cool, man. I'll see you soon, and we should do this again.
Yes. Okay.
Awesome.